Good afternoon. Welcome to Honoring Hispanic Heritage Month Resources for Teaching About the Holocaust. I am Linda Medvin. I am the director of Florida Atlantic University Center for Holocaust and Human Rights Education in Boca Raton, Florida. I thank you all for joining us today. We are very excited to welcome participants from all over Florida, as well as many states around the nation, and even participants from Spain and from Brazil. Florida legislation mandates required instruction of the Holocaust, as well as Hispanic contributions to the United States. We think that our topic today is appropriate, timely, and extremely relevant to the world that we are living in today. We are honored to have as our presenters, Cristina Chavarria, the program coordinator from the William Levine Family Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Sally Levine, the executive director for the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust, as well as being a museum fellow for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Please have the handouts that we sent ahead of time available because the presenters will be referring to them throughout their sessions. The chat on this has been disabled. Please put any questions that you may have in the Q&A section. We will have a Q&A at the end of each of the sessions that we, of the 3 sessions. And then at the very end, if we have some time, we'll be able to answer anything that we had not gotten to before that. I would like to welcome for our first session, Cristina Chavarria, The Roots of Anti-Semitism in the Hispanic World. Thank you, Cristina.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for this invitation, and hello to everyone and welcome to this program. I am Cristina Chavarria from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I want to thank Linda Medvin and her team for inviting us to be a part of this program today. Coincidentally, it is Mexican Independence Day, and this starts the month of Hispanic Heritage celebrations and examination of contributions, and looking at the greater world in Latin America, and also drawing on Spain and Portugal. So to Linda and to Florida Atlantic University, thank you so much for inviting the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to be a part of this very, very pertinent workshop. We are living in a time where we're seeing a great deal of change. We're looking more and more as a country at the contributions of everybody who lives here, and also exploring where many of those contributions come from. And that's very important because our classrooms are reflective of the diversity that this nation holds, and it will not stop. This diversity will continue, and we hope that everyone sees that as something very positive because of the great contributions that have been made already. And also it raises some questions too about the presentations that you're going to hear today on the intersections of the Hispanic world and what that has to do with teaching about the Holocaust. And there is actually quite a bit. And this is one of those topics where often we feel that the more we know, the more we realize what we don't know. So we are constantly gathering information at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We are constantly looking for collections around the world. A collection can be something that comes from one family or one individual, and it can also range all the way through the records of a particular country at that time. And so we're very fortunate that we have a team of researchers and archivists at the museum who have gone into the greater Americas, south of the Rio Grande, to collect a lot of the information, and some of which you'll see today. So when we look at the Holocaust, one of the things that we always consider is teaching the Holocaust in context, in its proper historical context. And one of those key points is to look at the role of anti-Semitism in the Holocaust. And the role of anti-Semitism in the Holocaust, it has to be understood that anti-Semitism was not created by the Nazis. They took it to a whole different level than what we had seen before. But anti-Semitism was not a new invention of Nazi Germany. And anti-Semitism tragically did not end with the Holocaust either. Unfortunately, we can look in the newspapers and almost daily we can see something of an incidence of anti-Semitic violence, vandalism, hate speech. And so we want to look at the museum. We want teachers to understand the roots of anti-Semitism and how to teach about them, and how to put them in the context of the Holocaust, but even to look at the roots of anti-Semitism prior to the Holocaust. And where does that lead us when we're talking about the Hispanic world? And probably the first place that we want to look at would be, in this regard, to look at the history of Spain. So we're going to share with you some PowerPoint slides and some images. And if we can go to the third image, the third slide. One of the things that we do want to stress when we teach about the Holocaust is to understand life before the Holocaust. And in any good teaching of any history, when you're looking at a group of people that has been persecuted, you don't want to only portray them in the sense that they're being persecuted. You don't want to portray them only as being victims. You want to look at the contributions of a group of people. So when we talk about teaching about the Holocaust, we don't want to look at the victims only as victims, but we want students to see them in the fullness of their lives, life before the Holocaust, life before the war. But if we're looking at the roots of anti-Semitism and we're looking at key points in anti-Semitism with regard to the Americas, one of the things that we want to look at is the history of Spain. So we asked you before the workshop to watch a 13-minute film that you can stream from our website called Anti-Semitism, Why the Jews? It also goes by the title European Anti-Semitism from Its Roots to the Holocaust. This is a 13-minute film that we have in our permanent exhibition at the museum, which right now is closed due to the pandemic, but we hope to reopen soon. This film gives you a comprehensive overview of anti-Semitism in Europe. And it starts off with the Crusades and it takes you to the culmination and the aftermath of the Holocaust. This is an excellent film to use in the classroom. But one of the things that we do want you to consider if you use the film that you hopefully watched before this is to think about who it's appropriate for. And we feel that the Holocaust should be taught from middle school on up. Now everybody has a different view, and if you teach it with the younger grades, you want to just be extra sensitive as to what they're mature enough to handle. So going back to the film that I'm referencing, in the film, if you listen very carefully, you do hear them mention Spain, but it's not something that is given a lot of attention in this very short film. So I wanted to start today off with talking a little bit about Spain, because we view Spain, for those of us who are of Latin descent or from the Americas, I mean, Spain is seen as the mother country, so to speak. And so also another thing that we want to understand about teaching this history is that when you teach about the Holocaust or any particular time in history, one of the things that we're finding to be most useful is that you teach history as a continuum. You don't need to set something apart from all the other parts of history, because when you do that, sometimes you can lose its complexity and you can lose the sense of understanding history as a continuum. So if you don't have time to teach a 1-week unit or a 2-week unit, and very few of us do have that kind of time to teach about the Holocaust, how do you teach about anti-Semitism in a way that you're not introducing it right at the beginning of studying 1933? So when you look at Spain and you look at the year of discovery, 1492, you can start to teach about anti-Semitism at that time. And one of the things that I encourage teachers to do is, again, teaching history as a continuum, so that you don't have to teach a unit, but you can look at all of the culminating steps toward a particular historical concept that is still with us, like anti-Semitism. And in Spain, we want to look at the pre-war Jewish life, not pre-war, excuse me, but pre-expulsion Jewish life in Spain before 1492. So if you've visited Spain, there are many remnants even today of Jewish life from hundreds of years ago, before the Jews of Spain were expelled. And these are some photos that we found that are online. They're in the public domain, and you can have this PowerPoint after today's presentation so that you may use these photos. If you visit Spain in cities like Toledo, for example, you will find many aspects of pre-expulsion Jewish life. This is Santa Maria la Blanca. It is now owned by the Catholic Church, but it was first built as a mosque in the year 1203, and it later on became a synagogue. And it's important to look at how one particular religious building goes from serving one type of religion to another, and then it comes to be in the hands of the Catholic Church. And this all raises some very good questions about understanding Jewish life in Spain in the golden age of Spain at that time. So if we move forward to the next slide, we see some photos of Jewish life in Seville, or Sevilla, if you would, in Andalusia, in southern Spain, closer to Africa. So these are some pictures of a church, St. Bartholomew Church, right in the heart of Seville. It was once a synagogue. It was built as a synagogue. And if you go in and you walk around the building, you will see that some of the architecture is very distinct of what synagogues looked like back in that time. But today it is a practicing Catholic church. And then if you look at the second photo, you will see Barrio Santa Cruz, which still has that sign saying Juderia, which is Jewish neighborhood in Spanish. So when you walk through Spain, there are many other cities. Cordoba has a lot to do with Jewish life before the expulsion. Girona, even Barcelona, Madrid, many of the major cities, you can find remnants of Jewish life in Spain. And the reason that I bring that up is because this was a time in world history and in Spanish history in particular, when Jews and Muslims lived together, not in perfect harmony necessarily, but there was a relative kind of peace. And yet at the same time, when you're looking at the history of anti-Semitism, Spain did experience pogroms. This is organized violence against Jewish people, and we learn about pogroms a lot when we study the time of the czars and the latter part of the 19th century. The organized violence like the Kristallnacht, that is considered to be a pogrom. There were pogroms in Spain prior to 1492. There was one in 1391 in Toledo, for example. And so there was a sense that even though the Jews in Spain had obtained certain levels of elevation in society, some of them worked directly with the monarchy, there was this sense that the foundation could really fall out from under them. And it's very important to start to understand that. One of the very unique elements when we look at anti-Semitism in Spain prior to the expulsion is the statutes of Toledo. And this was the idea that anybody who served the king and queen of Spain, and by this time that would be Ferdinand and Isabella, that they needed to have purity of blood, or what they say in what we call in Spanish, limpieza de sangre. And that meant that they could not be Jewish, they could not be Muslim. And this is really a striking characteristic, because a lot of times we think that the racial element of anti-Semitism started with the Nazis, but you can actually look at Spain and see that the whole concept of being a kind of pure person and not having any kind of background of somebody in your background being Muslim or Jewish, that would make your blood impure, so to speak. So this is where it begins. And then we get to the Alhambra Decree. And we don't have enough time to really go into the historical background, because in a moment we're going to look at some documents that have to do with anti-Semitism in Spain. But if you're teaching about anti-Semitism, this is a place where you can introduce it. But before you do that, we do encourage you to look at the richness of Jewish life in Spain prior. Because one of the things that we stress at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is, again, to not portray the victims only as victims. These are people who had full lives before, especially if they were adults, but they were people who are worthy of having their lives examined, not only in the sense of being victims, but as being full people with lives either behind them or even ahead of them if they were children. So this is why I'm introducing to you pre-expulsion Jewish life in Spain, because it does still exist today if you see Spain. And Spain didn't actually do away with the decree, the expulsion decree, and that started the Inquisition until 1968. It wasn't active after some time, but it wasn't until 1968 that it was formally taken off the books. It took 400 years. So there's a lot to consider in between then. So when we get to the year 1492, if we could look at the next slide, please. This is the expulsion decree of 1492. It's not something that I think a lot of teachers maybe look at, but if you are looking at the history of anti-Semitism, if you're going to teach a unit on the Holocaust and you want to look at the history of anti-Semitism and you want to bring in the Hispanic world, what I call the Ibero-American world, from Spain and Portugal reaching through the Americas up through the United States, this document is really pivotal in understanding the history of anti-Semitism. It's written in Spanish, and at the bottom you will see it. It's signed by the Catholic King and Queen, Ferdinand and Isabella. This document today, the original, is in the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv. It's been on display. I don't know if it is right now. I know that it is temporarily closed. But this is a very important document when we are looking at the history of anti-Semitism. And so we've provided it for you. Linda sent it to you in the email prior to this. We provided it for you in English and in Spanish. So I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to open up the document that you have of the decree in either language that you want to look at. So if you can do that right now. It is a very lengthy document. And this also gets back to the question of what is age appropriate to share with your students. So if you're teaching about the history of anti-Semitism and you want to bring in this document as an example of a document that did really change Spain and change the world, this would be one of them. but as you can see, it's a very, very lengthy one. The wording, it is a little difficult to read because it does have, as an English teacher, I find it a little excruciating because it does have run-on sentences, what we would consider today to be very long run-on sentences. But I would focus on the third and fourth paragraph because this really spells out what will happen. And so if you look at those two paragraphs, and you can look at all of this, let's take a few minutes just to read over those paragraphs and just to see what they're saying. And if we look carefully at them, what is happening, what is the decree saying, and what will happen to them if they do not leave. Okay, so just take a few minutes to look over this document. And even if you may even think of it as something you may not want to teach because it is rather difficult to read, but it is a very important document nonetheless in this history. So let's just take a few minutes to look this over. Paragraphs 3 and 4, and they're numbered in English. Okay, so if we look at paragraph 3, yes, it is the Alhambra decree. If we look at paragraph 3, and you can write this in the chat box or the Q&A, what is the crime? And what do you notice about the language in this particular paragraph? And you can put it in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing some of you may not have the documents, but if you do have the document on the Alhambra decree, the document basically states in that paragraph, it's saying that the Jews of Spain are committing crimes against the church, that some of those who have converted to Catholicism are still practicing their Judaism, and they are there, so therefore they should be held with great suspicion. It is rather difficult language, so again, I wouldn't use all of this document in the classroom, but it is something to examine just bit by bit in certain pieces. And if you look at the fourth paragraph, and hopefully if you have the documents, you can do that. We're working to get them to you right now to post them in the chat. If you look at the fourth paragraph, this is basically telling them that it has been decided, that the king and queen have decided, Ferdinand and Isabella have decided with their advisors that they must leave Spain, and that they must leave, that they may never come back, and if they do not leave, that it will really be on pain of death if they stay, and that they must take all their family with them, but what's really key here is that they may not take with them any of their valuable possessions. And why is this important when we're looking at the history of the Holocaust and we're looking at anti-Semitism? Because there are different steps to marginalization. And when we look at the history of anti-Semitism, there are three particular broad themes where earlier in the history of the world, and when we look at Jews as a monotheistic, people of a monotheistic faith, and first Jews are told that they may not live among the larger Christian world when Christianity becomes the dominant religion, especially in places like Europe, that they may not live among the people as Jews, so therefore they should convert. In Spain, you see a lot of conversion, but conversion doesn't matter anymore. They have to leave. And in the Holocaust, it's you may not live at all. It's complete annihilation and murder, starting in 1941 with the final solution and culminating in 1945. So this is kind of this is the second step in the history of anti-Semitism, where Jews are being told, you may not live among us, you have to get out, you have to go. So I apologize if you don't have the decree in front of you to look at it, but you will be receiving it. Again, it's very lengthy, it's not an easy read, but it is one of those pivotal documents in this history. And in the interest of time in reading, I would only read it very carefully with my students in world history class on up, and read it together as a class. This is not something that you want to give your students as an introduction to Judaism at all, but to the study of anti-Semitism. That's very important. So if we're going to move ahead very quickly because we want to leave a little bit of time for any questions that you may have. So just to continue with the history, Jewish immigration to Latin America. So it's very interesting to note that when the expulsion occurs and the Jews of Spain are forced to flee, there were many who actually came to the New World, came to the Americas. Not only to the United States, which we'll get to in a bit, but the first wave of Jewish immigration actually was to the Caribbean. If you ever been to the island of Curacao, Curacao has a very strong Jewish history from this time, from what we call Sephardic Jews. Now, if most of us, a lot of us are very familiar with the traditions of the Ashkenazi Jews. But Sephardic Jews are those people who have their roots in Spain. They are descendants of the diaspora from Spain, of the Jews of Spain. And many of them did go to the Americas. Some even went, they were called Nuevo Cristianos, new Christians, converts, who were forced to flee, and some even were known to have come over with Christopher Columbus because they were escaping. So all of this is really happening at the same time. As the expulsion is happening at the same time as the discovery of the Americas and coming over in 1492. If you've ever visited Brazil, the city of Recife, The synagogue there is the oldest synagogue in the Americas, north or south, and it still stands today. And the first Jews to come to New Amsterdam, which we now know as New York City, were actually Sephardic Jews who had first gone to Latin America and then came up to the Americas. And they had names that are very recognizable to many of us, such as Perez and Gomez. There is a whole history there that you can study in looking at Jewish settlement in the United States, particularly in New York. Even in South Carolina too, many Jews of Spanish descent, Sephardic Jews, also settled in South Carolina. So it's a very fascinating history, but again, to juxtapose not only the grave persecution of anti-Semitism, but also looking at the contributions of the Jewish people, which is very important, especially right now as we're going into Rosh Hashanah. And then we're going to just jump ahead very quickly to get to the point that we're dealing with, the Holocaust, Jewish immigration to Latin America. And again, that started in the 1400s and continued. And these are some pictures of some of the Russian Jews who are fleeing and settling in the Americas. If you look at the first picture at the top, these are Russian Jews fleeing the pogroms and coming to the New World. And then at the bottom picture, this is a family in Argentina that is celebrating Shabbat. So we're going to stop right there so that we can take some questions. And I'm going to open up the chat box here, and just some notes to you, some links to you, and let me see if we have any particular questions. Yes, so for those of you who were able to get the document, some of you pulled up the documents by Googling it. Thank you for doing that. We always know Google is really good for that and spur of the moment. But yes, the confiscation of possessions is very much a part of the Alhambra Decree. You can leave, but you cannot take it with you. And that's something that we will see again in the Holocaust as well. We also know that this is a lot of information to take in, and we will make book recommendations for you on where you can learn more about this. There are two books that I do want to mention to you that I use a lot for my research, and one of them is called The Ornament of the World, and it's about pre-expulsion Jewish life in Spain. It is excellent, excellent book. The second book is called The Origins of the Spanish Inquisition, and that is written by historian Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who is actually the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. Those are two very critical books in reading about the origins of anti-Semitism in Spain, the expulsion, and also pre-expulsion Jewish life. I'm not seeing any questions, but if anybody has any questions or comments, we are about to take a break. But anybody has anything they want to say, or Linda, if there's anything you want to say?
I would like to just remind people that the documents were sent out by email as attachments several times, as well as being put in a Google Drive with a link to that. If you did not get them, please put your email in address. We use the email address that you registered with. If you didn't get them or didn't realize that they were attachments that you needed to have for the sessions, just put your email into the Q&A to make sure that we can cross-check to verify that that's the email that we sent them to. These documents will also be posted tomorrow on our FAU, Center for Holocaust and Human Rights Education website, along with the PowerPoint and some other information. So just to cross-check your emails. Many of you might have just missed them. They were sent a couple of times. I sent them again yesterday. They were sent over the weekend as well. Christina, would you write the name of the book into the
Sure. I'm going to write it in the chat box.
We have a question about having access to the PowerPoint, and you did say yes, we would do that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so I've named the two books, and again, they have great information. There are other books out there. There's also another very good book that comes to mind. Farewell España, which is actually the name of a song that was sang in Ladino by Spanish Jews, and many of them actually sang it during the Holocaust when they were being deported as well. The Jews in Greece and Italy, many of them who were of Sephardic descent, they could trace their roots back to Spain. Thank you so much.
Okay. Are there any other questions? We'll be happy to answer them. If not, we will take a 10-minute break. Is that what we're going to do?
There is one question, if I can just answer it, and if you all want to take a break, that's great. As you're preparing for Holocaust Week in November, how would you begin the week? With the history of Spain? You know, it just depends on how much time you have. You don't have to. Of the topic of Hispanic heritage, we wanted to begin with Spain since it's seen as the mother country of the Americas. But you certainly, one of the things that we recommend is actually starting with the end of the First World War, and the conditions of the Versailles Treaty is a good place to start. But if you have more time and you want to address the Americas and bring in Hispanic Heritage Month or elements of this, you can certainly start there. If you're looking at the history of anti-Semitism, you may want to include Spain as an example of where we first see anti-Semitism in the world. So thank you, very good question.
Okay. We will reconvene at 4:50. All right.
Okay, can they hear us?
Yes.
Okay. So I will start with the drawing then, since we didn't have time to get to it. I'll start with that illustration. Cody, slide 8, I think it is. Or 7, slide 7.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to welcome everyone back from their break. Am I live here? Can you hear me, Christina?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. I am very pleased to welcome Sally Levine. I have never had before this, the opportunity to work with her, and I can't wait to work with her again because we've had a great time preparing this in the midst of the pandemic and everything else. She is going to present on one of my favorite subjects and one of the things that has intrigued me for many, many years, the voyage of the St. Louis. So thank you, Sally Levine.
Thank you, Linda Medvin. And thank you all for joining us today. If we can start with the slides, please. I'm Sally Levine. I'm a museum teacher fellow from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I'm also the executive director of the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust. We are a secular, nonpartisan government agency in Georgia. And for those of you who are in the Gulf Coast of Florida, you may have heard my name on the Weather Channel. Sally has become very popular, unfortunately. So, okay, slide 2, please. So in honor of Latin American History Month, today we're going to talk about the ill-fated voyage of the St. Louis. We're also going to look at a lot of museum resources that can support our teaching of this topic. Study of this history touches many themes that are important in our classrooms. The plight of refugees, immigration and refugee policy or lack of refugee policy, and what it means to have the rights and responsibilities of being a citizen, and what can happen when those rights are taken away. So let's again look at history in context. 82 years ago, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, Jews in Nazi Germany and its occupied territories were subjected to ruthless destruction and incarceration in what became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On that night, shattered glass littered the streets, and Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes were vandalized and destroyed. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. The violence of Kristallnacht was a dramatic escalation of Nazi policy. Laws were passed which deprived Jews of their citizenship, their property and businesses, and their right to participate in German political, economic, and cultural life. This was the first time that Nazi officials had unleashed widespread assaults and devastation against the Jewish community. After Kristallnacht, the Jewish community was forced to pay a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks to compensate Germany for the property damage, and new anti-Jewish laws and decrees soon followed. It became clear to many Jews under Nazi occupation that it was imperative that they leave. From polling at that time, we know that Americans were sympathetic to the plight of Jewish Germans. The weak economy and high unemployment rates in the United States, however, as well as racism and anti-Semitism, drove public opinion on immigration. The majority of Americans did not want to relax immigration policy to allow Jewish refugees into this country. We can view Kristallnacht as a significant turning point in Nazi Germany's persecution of the Jews. This event was not spontaneous, but the result of widespread government-instigated and sanctioned violence. It culminated in the Nazi attempt to solve the Jewish question, in quotes, once and for all, by murdering Europe's Jews. We're now going to look at some of the resources that are available from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we all know that it's crucial that as educators, we vet the sources that our students use. The museum's online Holocaust Encyclopedia provides articles in 15 languages, including Spanish, which accurately tell the story of the Holocaust. The articles take into account the varied learning styles of our students, and they use photographs, films, testimonies, maps, and objects to tell and support the written articles. Most encyclopedia entries contain powerful critical thinking questions as well as links to other articles and resources so that we can learn more about these topics. On its website, the museum also features a series of animated maps. Just minutes long, they're a great teaching tool. They provide brief, comprehensive overviews of topics. In a map format, it helps to strengthen students' geography skills. In the map that we're going to look at today, we're going to learn more about the voyage of the St. Louis. But first, a bit of history. On May 13, 1939, the German transatlantic liner St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany for Havana, Cuba. Of the 937 passengers on board, most were Jews trying to escape Nazi persecution and violence. In March of 1938, the Germans annexed Austria, and Jewish Austrians became victims of persecution and physical violence as well. Then Kristallnacht in November of that year, and the subsequent appropriation of Jewish property and businesses in Nazi-controlled areas resulted in a rush for visa applications. The story of the St. Louis highlights the plight of Jewish refugees. Desperate to leave persecution behind, they were not welcome many places else.
On May 13, 1939, the MS St. Louis, a German passenger ship, began its journey from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba. The ship carried 937 passengers. Most were Jews seeking temporary refuge in Cuba as they waited for immigration visas to the United States. When the ship arrived in Havana, most of the passengers were not allowed to disembark. They had unknowingly purchased fraudulent landing permits from a corrupt Cuban government official. The ship sat in the harbor for nearly 1 week while a relief agency called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, tried to persuade the Cuban government to admit the refugees. After negotiations broke down, the ship steered toward Miami, Florida. The refugees and their supporters on land appealed to the public, the press, and even to President Roosevelt and the First Lady. The president never responded, and the State Department did not take any measures to admit the St. Louis passengers. As the ship crossed the Atlantic on its return to Germany, the Joint's European director, Morris Troper, worked tirelessly with State Department staff in Western Europe to find safe havens for the passengers. Troper's last-ditch efforts were successful. 4 Western European countries, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, issued entry visas to the St. Louis passengers. They would not be forced to return to Nazi Germany. But the passengers were not safe from future danger because Nazi Germany soon invaded 3 of the countries where they had landed. Many of the passengers were still on the waiting list for U.S. immigration visas 1 year later, but immigration to the United States was nearly impossible. Of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis, 254 were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II. In August 1940, the SS Kwanzaa sailed from Lisbon to New York, carrying more than 300 passengers. Most were Jewish refugees. Europe had been at war for nearly a year, and it was getting even harder for refugees to cross the Atlantic Ocean. 200 Kwanzaa passengers who held U.S. immigration visas disembarked in New York. The remaining passengers, who did not have U.S. visas, continued to Veracruz, Mexico. Mexico, however, claimed that at least 80 of the passengers did not have the right paperwork. Their admission was denied. When the Kwanzaa's passengers realized that the ship would stop in Norfolk, Virginia to refuel before returning to Lisbon, they sent frantic telegrams to family members, Jewish organizations, and the U.S. government. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed her personal interest in the fate of the refugees. One family on board hired Jacob Morwitz, a local Virginia attorney, who sued the shipping company for failing to deliver the passengers to their intended destination. Many other passengers also filed suits. A federal judge ordered the ship to stay in Norfolk while Morwitz's case was reviewed by the court. While the ship waited in Norfolk, the State Department investigated the remaining passengers. All were allowed to disembark in the United States. The Kwanzaa passengers sent letters of gratitude to the State Department and the White House, including flowers for the First Lady. But Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long was angry about being forced to admit refugees from the Kwanzaa. He made it clear to U.S. consulates in Europe that the State Department would not tolerate any further incidents in the future.
Okay, so we had a little bit of a glitch here in terms of which film we were watching. This was the one about the St. Louis and the Kwanzaa. And what I'd like to tell you about this one is that it is part of a brand new exhibition at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Of course, the museum right now is closed, but you can access this exhibition online at the museum's website. It raises very important questions. What could the United States have done to stop the rise of Nazism in Germany and its assault on European Jews? And what did the US government and the American people know about the threats posed by Nazi Germany? And what kinds of responses might have been possible? And when might they have been most effective? We can also look at what were the motivations and pressures that may have kept Americans from stepping up to doing more. The St. Louis is just one story in the saga of attempted Jewish immigration from Nazi-dominated Europe. And as we know, the story of the Kwanzaa did not end the same way. If we can go back to the next film, if possible, which is the animated map. Okay, I think that's it. And let me just say before we start this one, that there are animated maps on many, many different topics, and they are a great way to not only introduce your students to these topics, but it also helps to support your students' geography skills, which we know are really important. Okay, if you begin this film, please. Okay, are we having an issue with this one? There we go.
With Hitler's rise to power, the Nazis began the systematic persecution of Jews in Germany. Nazi violence and the destruction of Jewish-owned property spread throughout many cities during the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938. Many Jews decided to leave Germany in the face of this growing threat. Their preferred destinations were the British Mandate of Palestine and the United States. However, both imposed quotas strictly limiting the number of emigrants. Desperate to escape Nazi Germany, 937 passengers, almost all of them Jewish refugees, boarded the ship St. Louis and departed Hamburg for Havana, Cuba on May 13, 1939. About 2 weeks later, they arrived in Havana. Cuban officials refused to allow the refugees to land, claiming that the passengers' landing certificates, purchased from a corrupt consular official in Germany, were invalid. Only 28 passengers, among them 22 Jews who had secured valid Cuban visas, were allowed to disembark in Havana. The rest lingered on the ship for 5 days, as a representative of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee negotiated with the Cuban government. Negotiations failed. The ship was ordered out of Cuban waters and sailed slowly toward Miami. Telegrams requesting refuge were sent to the White House and U.S. State Department, but entry was denied. The St. Louis turned back toward Europe. During the return voyage, 4 Western European countries agreed to take the refugees. The passengers disembarked in Antwerp on June 17, 1939, after more than a month at sea. With the German invasion of Western Europe in 1940, many of the St. Louis passengers were again trapped under Nazi rule.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at the fact that the St. Louis was sent back from the United States back to Europe, it's important that we think about what might have been the reasons why Americans did not want to let refugees in at the time. There was no refugee policy, but we also need to look at the context. We need to look at what was happening to the United States economy at that time. We also need to look at unemployment as well as anti-Semitism. Now we're going to look at another program and project that's been run by the United States Holocaust Museum, and that is History Unfolded, U.S. Newspapers and the Holocaust. This program is an opportunity for educators, students, and ordinary citizens to identify and explore contemporaneous newspaper articles about the Holocaust. From this activity, they may learn what Americans across the country knew about the Holocaust and how they responded as the history unfolded. The website describes the process, and it says, participants search in newspaper archives online and at libraries for articles about the Nazi threat in the 1930s and 40s. As of September 9th of this year, 2020, over 4,300 participants from across the country had already submitted more than 37,000 articles from their local newspapers. The articles were published in newspapers located in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and they represent news articles, editorials, letters to the editor, political cartoons, and advertisements. Through their work, these citizen historians have learned about Holocaust history. They've used primary sources in their historical research and have challenged assumptions about American knowledge of and responses to the Holocaust. Their findings prompt us to reflect on America's role in the world today. So now we're going to look at a lesson on History Unfolded, Spanish language newspapers' coverage of the Holocaust. We're going to examine this essential question, which is important to understand history and also to understand what's happening today. How can journalism shape public knowledge of and responses to events in the world around us? And here's the rationale for the lesson. By focusing on how Spanish language newspapers in Texas, California, and Puerto Rico reported on the voyage of the St. Louis, students will connect Holocaust history to American history and develop primary and secondary source reading and analysis skills in Spanish. Students will also develop media literacy skills that will prepare them to analyze and respond to our news today. So this lesson looks at 3 Spanish language newspapers. El Heraldo de Brownsville was the Spanish language newspaper in Brownsville, Texas. This newspaper published daily issues except on Saturdays. El Mundo was a Spanish language newspaper from San Juan, Puerto Rico. In 1939, and still today, Puerto Rico is the territory of the United States. El Mundo published daily issues. And then there was La Opinión, a Spanish language newspaper from Los Angeles, California. And in 1939, this newspaper was printed daily. The geographic locations of each of these newspapers and their readerships would have had an effect on the news they carried, the importance they gave that news in terms of where they located the articles, and the information they chose to include and emphasize versus the information they left out or minimized. So we're going to look at just one of these articles today, and that is the article in El Mundo. That was the newspaper from Puerto Rico. Notice the location of the article in the upper right-hand corner of page 2 of the July 2nd, 1939 edition. And let's talk about a brief timeline of the events to examine what role, if any, these may have had in the content of this article. So on March 12th and 13th of 1938, there was the Anschluss, German troops entered Austria, and Austria was incorporated into Germany. And then November 9th and 10th of 1938 was Kristallnacht. And the following year, May 8th, 1939, the largest anti-Semitic demonstration in Cuba's history took place. Remember, May 8th, 1939. And then just 5 days later, on May 13th, 1939, the St. Louis departed from Hamburg, Germany for Havana, Cuba, with its 937 passengers on board. On May 27th, 1939, the St. Louis arrived in Havana, Cuba, and only 28 passengers were admitted. On May 28th, 1939, Lawrence Berenson, representing the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, arrived in Cuba to negotiate on behalf of the passengers. By June 2nd, the date of this article, negotiations had failed, and the Cuban president had ordered the St. Louis out of Cuban waters. A few days later, on June 6, 1939, denied permission to dock in Miami, the St. Louis begins its journey back to Europe. And as you know, 4 European governments agreed to take the refugees: Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And only Great Britain in the coming years would not be occupied by Nazi Germany. So now I'm going to read to you the article aloud, and I'm going to read it in English, and you're lucky that I'm not going to be reading it in Spanish. Cuba refuses to receive 900 Jewish refugees, and it announces that it will resort to force to remove the steamer they are traveling in from Cuban waters if it does not leave the port at once, by Lawrence Haas. Havana, June 1st. The president of Cuba issued a decree prohibiting the landing of more than 900 Jewish refugees who have been on the board the steamer St. Louis in the port of Havana for 4 days, and ordering the ship to leave Cuban waters immediately. Laredo Brew's decree came after a conference with the president of the House Immigration Committee, who told the press that the bill presented in the House provides for the expulsion of all Jews who arrived in Cuba since November 1st. It is estimated that since then, about 4,000 Jews have arrived and are said to have entered illegally. The Secretary of the Treasury instructed that the St. Louis issue be investigated and that responsibility be determined for the transportation of Jews to Cuba in violation of immigration regulations. Meanwhile, the steamer is anchored in the middle of the harbor, guarded by the port police patrol that does not allow anyone on board and prevents other boats from approaching the ship full of Jews. A police boat circles the ship, whose railings are crowded with refugees, looking longingly towards land. The shipping company's lawyer said that the St. Louis will not leave the port until the matter is decided in the courts of law. "We are going to fight," he said. The ship is reportedly eager to disembark the refugees due to the expense of 2,800 meals per day. But it is rumored that the passengers had to pay return fares from Hamburg in advance as a precaution against having to return to Germany. Although the refugees brought passports that had been endorsed by Cuban consular authorities in Germany, the Cuban government says that those visas were extended in violation of recent immigration regulations that prohibit the entry of more Jews into Cuba. In the 4 days that the ship has been in port, there have been 2 suicide attempts. But in general, the refugees do not give the impression of being discouraged. Interviewed from a boat, most show optimism. Some, however, look anxious about the long wait. The decree that finally destroys all hope of landing provides for the use of public force to remove the St. Louis from Cuban waters in case the Hamburg American line does not comply with the order to leave. The decree also specifies that all passengers must remain on board because, and I quote, "their disembarkation has not been authorized," unquote, and provides for the arrest of any crew member or passenger who illegally disembarks by escaping from the ship. Okay, so think about the language, the tone, and the content of this article. And now let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so one of the questions that the worksheet asks is what other articles were vying for attention on this page? And we can see with a photograph that a parade actually was vying for attention on this page. And what questions does the article raise for you? What are the issues the article focuses on? And it focuses on immigration law and the fact that those people were coming there illegally. Why might the Cuban authorities be willing to use force? And think about the fact that there had been this anti-Jewish demonstration just days before. And what issues are not mentioned in the article? And why do you think they're not included? Well, certainly we don't hear about why these passengers are on this ship. We don't hear anything about anti-Semitism. We just hear about immigration. So it's kind of interesting to look at this from a totally different perspective than what we would have heard from American newspapers. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Herbert Karliner, who is a Holocaust survivor. And some of you may have seen a recent study by the Shoah Foundation and Echoes and Reflections, which concluded that the most powerful and enduring effects of Holocaust education actually come from survivor testimonies. And today we're going to hear a portion of a testimony. We are going to close our session today and our study of the St. Louis with the story of Herbert Karliner and his family. Here we can see photos of Mr. Karliner and his family. And these photographs are part of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's photo collection. And again, it can be accessed on their website. Herbert Karliner was born in Germany in 1926. He had 3 siblings, an older sister, Ilse, an older brother, Walter, and a younger sister, Ruth. His parents, Martha and Joseph, ran a grocery store. On Kristallnacht in November of 1938, the family store was destroyed and his father was arrested and imprisoned in Buchenwald. He was let out a couple of months later, and it was then that the family knew that they had to flee. In 1939, the family booked passage on the St. Louis. And as we all know, after the majority of passengers were denied entry to Cuba, the ship skirted the shore of Miami Beach, and passengers hoped to be admitted to the United States. But they were denied entry here too. Forced to return to Europe, arrangements were made for the 902 Jewish refugees on board to disembark, as we said, in the Netherlands, England, France, and Belgium. The Karliner family ended up in France. From 1939 until 1943, Herbert lived in children's homes and worked at a bakery. But once Paris was occupied by the Nazis and the homes were no longer safe for Jewish children, Herbert hid out and worked on farms until he was liberated. At the war's end, he learned that his parents and both of his sisters had been murdered in the Holocaust. In 1946, Herbert emigrated to the United States. Today, Herbert Karliner lives in Miami Beach, the place he viewed from the deck of the St. Louis. So let's close with Mr. Karliner's testimony. The museum website has many testimonies available on its website about the St. Louis, as well as other parts of Holocaust history. Herbert Karliner's story comes to us from an interview with C-SPAN.
Cuban was wonderful, especially for us kids. I never been on a big ship, I never been on the ocean, but for my parents it was very difficult to start a life again. We were 4 children. I had 2 sisters, a brother and myself. We arrived in Havana. We had all our suitcases ready in front of the doors. And the Cuban police came up and said, we have to check your papers. We waited for 1 day, 2 days, The first word I learned in Spanish was mañana. But mañana never came. They joined, negotiated with the Cuban government to let us in. When the joint wanted to give them $1 million, they wanted $2 million. When they gave $2 million, they wanted $4 million. Finally, they couldn't raise no more money, and the Cuban told us to get out. And the captain was a hell of a nice guy. He said, we're going to cruise in the state of Florida, and if somebody will let us in. We sent telegram to President Roosevelt, we didn't get no answer. To Mrs. Roosevelt, to let the children off the ship. Again, we didn't get no answer. Sent telegram to Canada, South America, Central America. Nobody wanted us in. Let me tell you, it's true. I happened to see Miami Beach when I was 12 years old from the ship. And I was very impressed. And I said to myself, I would like to live here someday. Well, it took me a long way to get around there. The Coast Guard came and chased us away from Miami. And we had to go back to Europe.
Okay, and that is just a portion of his interview. So we all know that Holocaust history is a challenging history to teach, and having reliable and accessible and accurate resources in Spanish, as well as articles, maps, testimony, newspapers, photographs, films, and objects helps to support our teaching and reach our students where they are. Thank you for participating in this session, and please feel free to reach out with any questions you might have. Thank you.
We have one comment, which I agree with, is that the animated map is amazing, great way to engage students. So we appreciate you bringing that to our attention, Sally, because of all of the resources that the museum does offer. Many of them have become animated and much more engaging than just reading.
Well, and it also covers a lot of history in a short period of time, which is what many of us need to do.
Correct. One of the most worthwhile pieces of literature, not literature, but it's really a research study, is the book Refuge Denied by Scott Miller and Sarah Ogilvie. In the supplemental resources that I sent, there is a reading guide for the book, as well as some information about it. But this book is, if you're like me and you love research, Scott Miller and Sarah Ogilvie were able to track down every single person that was on that ship, whether they were, whether they were deceased from the Holocaust and they changed their name, they got married, they were children, they weren't children, but every single person is accounted for in that book. And it's really, a tremendous work of research and digging and sleuthing to find it. We have the book at our center available in class sets. If we ever get back to work and you ever all get back to school, we would be happy to lend them to you. But it is an excellent source. And I always, throw out that one of the most famous people on the ship was who, Sally?
I'm not sure I know who you're talking about.
Billy Joel's family. I
did not know that.
Billy Joel's father and uncle, I believe, were on the St. Louis and were able to get off and survive. I think they went back to Vienna, but they were on the ship. So who knows? Go know. It's all about showbiz. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, I think this is a group that's angling to get to have an early dismissal from this workshop. But we will thank you, Sally, for your very effective and interesting presentation. We will break now for another 10 minutes. It's 5:29. We will be back at 5:30 39. If anybody has any questions or wants to chat, we will send you, we'll be available here. Just, you know, put it out in the Q&A, and we will continue. We are running our wonderful tech person, Cody, who we love, and we thank God for every minute of this session, is going to run the loop of a PowerPoint loop. It's a little bit about our center. It's a little bit about the legislation in Florida. Many of you are from Florida. There are those of you that are not, but have similar legislation. It also talks a little bit about some of the events that are coming up that we offer to our main school districts in South Florida, Broward, Palm Beach, St. Lucie, Martin counties. So, you know, and our next workshop, which will be October 22nd, from swastika to Jim Crow, which will be all the information, and will also be by Zoom webinar. So you have now 9 minutes. I'm sorry, but go ahead. We have a break. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody back. We are moving into our third session, and I'd like to welcome back Christina as our presenter for about Latin America and the Holocaust, and about refuge, which is answers a question that everybody asks, and Christina will say it, but I will say it, is why didn't they just leave? So that's part of it. Please put your questions into the Q&A because we'll finish them up. And at the end of the session, we'll go over some of the housekeeping, because I've gotten some questions about that, as far as information that you need for your school districts and that we need from you in certain instances. So Christina, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Linda. And thank you. I want to also give a special shout out to Cody, who is handling all of the technology. This would not be running so smoothly if it were not for Cody. So Cody, thank you again for everything that you're doing. And a big shout out to Sally for the excellent presentation that was done on our lesson that was created specifically for Spanish language instruction from History Unfolded. And Sally got to the heart of some of the issues that we're going to look at in this presentation now that I'm going to do with you. And Linda brought it up too. Why didn't they just leave? A lot of our students will ask us, why didn't, if things were so bad, why did they stay? And we really need to get to the heart of that question. And one of the things that we first have to understand is looking at, in immigration studies, we look at push factors and pull factors. So push factors, we look at those things that would cause a person to want to leave a place where they are living. So you were asked in the email that went out before to watch the film, The Path to Nazi Genocide, particularly Chapter 3, From Citizens to Outcasts. And that shows how the Jews in Germany in the earlier years up to 1939, how the persecution became what it was, to where they realized they needed to leave. If they had not tried to leave before, now was the time, especially after Kristallnacht, which Sally spoke about. So just very briefly, if you can put in the chat box, what would be some push factors that are pushing the Jews of Germany, of the Third Reich at the time? And that would also include the Jews of Austria, Austrian Jews, because now Austria is part of the Third Reich. If you can put in the chat box, just what are some push factors that are pushing them out of the Third Reich? So if you could list those in the chat box, that would be great.
The chat is disabled, Christina. They need to put it in
okay,
Q&A.
I'm sorry, put it in Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you, sorry. Just take a minute to list some things that are pushing, what are the push factors, pushing them out of the Third Reich by the end of 1938 and 1939. Okay, great. Loss of jobs, loss of business, increasing danger. Yes, anything else? The economic and political situation, the discrimination, the loss of their national identity. Yes, they lost their citizenship. Even if you were born there and you were Jewish, you were stripped of that. Kristallnacht is an example, because that really shows the grave physical danger and the destruction of culture, of a way of life, of religion. All of these are push factors, things that make a person feel that he or she or they have to leave a country. So that's very important. So excellent. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at an illustration. If you have it on your computer or you printed it out, fantastic. It's got a German heading and it's called, in English, it's From Our Old Home to Our New Home. So we're going to look at that on the slide, on the PowerPoint. So if you can pull up, Linda sent the drawing to you. This is it. This is one of my all-time favorite primary source documents. And I love it for many reasons, but let's look at this document for a few minutes. And I'm going to ask you some questions about it. And these are document-based questions. These are questions that go with document analysis. So write your answers, if you would, in the Q&A. What is this? What do you think this is? It's some illustration of some sort, but what do you think it is? Okay, who do you think drew it? Okay, is it Christopher Columbus's map? Not quite. We're looking at the 1930s now. If you look at the dates closely, we're in the 20th century. It is a voyage of Jewish immigrants, maybe, an immigration chain, immigration to South America, the path to the camps. Okay. Maybe a teenager drew it. So that answers the next question. How old do you think the artist is? What can you see what the final date is? Who can, if you look closely at it, I know it's very small, but can if you can give the final date, and where does this person end up? Okay, getting some good answers. 1938, yes. Okay, good. It's actually 1938. Okay, it's a teenager. Okay, so this starts off in Germany. If you look at the drawing, it starts off in Germany. Okay, and actually, so let me tell you a little bit about this drawing, and you'll get the questions that go with the drawing and the background. So from our old home to our new home, the person who drew it is named Fritz Freudenheim. Fritz is a 12-year-old German Jewish boy, and he's actually starting off with the date, the 14th of May in Berlin in 1925. It's not his birth date. He's starting off with his parents' wedding anniversary. Then he gets to his birth date, and then he takes you through the family's voyage. They leave Hamburg on October 23rd, 1938. If you look closely, you can see Hamburg, and it gives the date. And remember that, you know, in the United States, we put the month first and then the day and the year. But the European tradition and pretty much everyone else in the world, a lot of places you put the day first, the month. So the 23rd is the 23rd of October. And if you look carefully, you know, he's a child, he's 12 years old. And what he's doing is he's listing all of the places that the boat stops, all of the different ports. And it's really compelling because they go to Belgium, they stop in France, they stop in Spain, then they stop in Morocco, and then they finally set sail across the Atlantic. And then they first go to Rio de Janeiro, then they go to a town called Santos. Look at the way he draws Latin America. You can see Brazil, you can see Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia. He draws all these countries, and they finally end up in Montevideo, Uruguay, on a street, Calle Sotelo, calle being street in Spanish. So this is a young boy's journey. And he started drawing it actually when they were going across the Atlantic. And he finished drawing it after they settled in Uruguay. So Fritz Freudenheim, he later changed his name to Federico, and he lived the rest of his life in South America, and he died in Brazil in 2008. The drawing is still in the possession of his family, but we include the drawing in a book called Children and the Holocaust. But we're giving you the drawing here because it's in color. So you have the file, and if you don't, Linda will get it to you. These will be posted on the website. And so there are questions that you can ask your students. Who drew it? What was the purpose? And even though we don't know his specific purpose, it's pretty surmisable and safe to say that he drew it to document his journey. And this is a young boy, and not many people of his age at that time were making this kind of voyage. But we have to ask ourselves, why was his family leaving? And this is a good introduction to why they had to leave, the push factors, and now we want to investigate where could they go, and why did some people end up going to Latin America. So if we can go to the next slide. So we often think about Latin America with regard to the Holocaust. Often the questions are about the Nazis who went there. But just like the United States, we want to look at some of the reasons why Latin America was maybe not always a desirable place to go, but yet at the same time, refugees did go there, and what were some of those reasons? So what we're looking at here are the pull factors. What makes countries in Latin America a very attractive prospect? And what are some of what we now call the pushback factors? You had the voyage of the St. Louis, and Sally, that is an example of pushback. They try to go to Cuba, they try to come here to the United States, and we examine the reasons why they couldn't come or they couldn't stay. And that gets to the heart of the question, why didn't they just leave? You have to look at the immigration laws of a particular country. Most of us, because we are here in the United States, we look at the United States, and as Sally mentioned, we have an exhibit with all of the online support material that Sally shared with you for looking at the pushback factors for coming to the US. But now we're also looking at Latin America, because we do have many records from Latin America. We're continually collecting more information from organizations and individuals in Latin America, from Argentina on up, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, all the way up to Mexico, including Central America. And so for the purpose of today, we're going to share with you some of those pull factors and those pushback factors, so that when your students ask that question, why didn't they just leave? We have to understand the obstacles to immigration. And this was a global issue. It wasn't only the United States, it was also south of the border from us. So if we can go to the next slide. What we're going to do right here is show you some film footage. This film footage was taken by the Joint Distribution Committee. Sally brought up the Joint Distribution Committee earlier, and their role in trying to help the refugees who were on the St. Louis, trying to find them a safe place to stay so that they wouldn't have to go back to Germany and Austria. What we're going to look at here is historical film footage. It doesn't have any audio, but this is some historical film footage of European Jewish refugees who did make it to Latin America. So Cody's going to play the film, and I'm going to just give a little bit of narration about the film. So here are some refugees in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the things, if you show this film footage, and you'll get this film footage with the PowerPoint, it's embedded and it's also on our website, and we've included the link, is to think about how different the environment would be. If you're coming from a city like Berlin or Vienna, what is the climate difference like? The altitude, the language. This is Venezuela, and this is a kind of like a soup kitchen that's been set up to welcome the Jewish refugees. It's right outside of Caracas. Again, this is a totally different climate. These are things to consider. Keep in mind, this is before the final solution. And you can see the Venezuelan Red Cross sign there. It's in Spanish. These are women volunteers for the Red Cross in Venezuela. This is a refugee from Vienna in Venezuela. Here's some more refugees, and we can tell where they are. They're in Ecuador. Now look at the landscape here. We see a lot of desert. We see cactus. You don't really have that in Germany or Austria so much. This is a very different climate for them. And these are things that you had to consider. If you were somebody who had health issues, you were elderly, you had breathing problems, it might have been very difficult for you to go there and adjust. These are all things that they had to take into consideration. If at that time you're 60, 70 years old and you don't speak Spanish, that could be a deterrent to going there, but yet people still did go. These are some more refugees. This is in Peru. This is outside of Lima. And you get on our website, you get all of the background information on this film footage. It was taken by a man named David Glick, an American man who went to South America for the Joint Distribution Committee to interview the refugees who had gone there to see how life was like for them, to consider if they wanted to help more German and Austrian Jews go to Latin America. Now this is in the early years, before the final solution, before the war begins. This is leading right up to the war, which begins, of course, later in September 1939. So if we go to the next slide, what we're going to do right now is to look at the handouts that Linda sent you. And you have a particular handout that is titled Emigration and Immigration to Latin America. Okay, so if you can locate that handout, Immigration to Latin America. It gives you a list of it gives you examples of push factors, pull factors, and pushback factors. And so what we're going to do is, you have also some documents, and Cody is putting the link up for you. You have some other documents that go with it that were sent to you. And these documents are the pictures that you see right here. Argentina, there are 2 for Argentina and 2 for Mexico. So if you look at the instructions that Cody's giving in the chat box, you can find the documents in the link. So the first handout that I mentioned, Emigration and Immigration, gives you the lesson plan. It gives you the layout. And we're not going to have time to go through the entire lesson plan, but it is a lesson plan in which you look at 5 countries. It's like a case study of 5 countries, and we will include all of the rest of the documents. Linda has them, and she'll put them up on the website for the other countries as well. But for the purpose of time, we're looking at Argentina and Mexico. So there's also another handout that has pull factors and pushback factors for Argentina and Mexico. And Cody, did you share that one with them too? It's the one that I sent today, this afternoon. It has some historical points.
Yeah, I'm uploading that right now.
Oh, okay, great. So Cody's uploading a document. Before we look at these primary source documents, this photo, for example, that we have up, Cody is sending a document that gives you some historical facts about Argentina and Mexico. So if you access that document that Cody's sending and you open it up, you will see these factors for Mexico and Argentina. And what we want to do right now is take a couple of minutes. You also received this particular illustration. You should have received the file that has this picture. Okay, so refresh your browser and the documents will appear. If you do that, you'll see the documents. So what we want to do right now is look at this document that we have up on the screen right now. It's a photo and it shows a door that's closed and it has a sign on the front of it. It's in Spanish, so if you have Spanish-speaking students or students who can read Spanish, you can ask them to translate, but we also have the English translation at the top. So this is a sign that says, "We are Catholic. We feel the pain of our Jewish siblings. A store in Buenos Aires closes in response to Kristallnacht, November 1938. Okay, so that raises some questions that are very interesting. Why would a Catholic store, or why would a store owned by Catholics in Buenos Aires close in response to Kristallnacht? So this is where we look at this document. And what the lesson is asking you to do, if you go to the handout, Immigration to Latin America, if you go to that document and you scroll down, it's got several parts to it, but if you scroll down to the second page, you'll see a section titled Country Case Studies. And Argentina is the first country. And it says, from the pull factors listed on the front of the envelope, you don't have the envelope in this case, but you do have the pull factors with you for Argentina and the pushback factors. From the pull factors listed on the front, from the pull factors, let's just say, which one do you think would be the most important over all the rest is the deciding factor to emigrate to Argentina, and why? Okay. So what you want to do is look at this picture, and judging from this picture, is this picture encouraging a pull to go to Argentina if you are a Jewish refugee seeking refuge in Argentina, or is this an example of a pushback factor? Okay, these are the questions that the lesson asks your students to look at the factors sheet and then to look at the picture. And so if you can put your responses in the Q&A, is this picture an example of a pull to go to Argentina, or is it an example of pushback if you were a Jewish refugee? So let's see. I'm going to look over some of the responses. Okay, pull factor. Okay, good. It is a pull factor, and let's type in some of our reasons why would it be an example of a pull factor. What is it about this picture that symbolizes, that exemplifies pull? If you can type those in, that would be great. Okay, shows solidarity with the Jewish people. It's very welcoming. It shows support and empathy. It shows religious tolerance. So if you look at some of the factors that are listed on the sheet for Argentina, this picture is interesting, and one of the reasons why we selected it is because Argentina actually by this point didn't want Jewish refugees. It wanted to build itself up as a Catholic nation. It was not, by this point, very sympathetic to Jewish immigration. And yet you still have individual peoples like the owners of this store who still sympathized. So that's very important, something to note. These people are more tolerant, they're more accepting, they're more caring perhaps. One of the things to note on that list, it's given to you, is that Argentina did and still does have the largest Jewish population in Latin America. It's the 7th largest in the world. The Argentinian Jewish community is very active in all aspects of life. So thank you so much. Yes, this would be a good example of a pull factor. So let's look at the second document, and that's on the next slide. And you should have this as a file that was sent to you. And for this one, we're working to translate it in English. But for this one, if we have any people among our participants who read Spanish, what this is doing is it's telling us, this is a document that was sent from Argentina to its embassies in Germany, in Austria, and Czechoslovakia, because by this point, those 3 countries make up the Third Reich. And it's listing what Jewish immigrants need, what kind of documentation they need if they want to go to Argentina. And this is March of '39. This is after Kristallnacht. And now the Jews of the Third Reich are desperate to get out, and they're applying everywhere that they can in order to find a place of refuge. So if we have any Spanish readers who can give us examples of what you need to go to Argentina, if you can list them in the Q&A, that would be great. Oh, Esther. Hi, Esther. It's so good to have you in here. I haven't seen you in a long time. Okay. Birth certificate, yes. What are some things that you might need that might be hard for you to get by this time? Think about that. How easy is it to be able to acquire the things that you need to go to Argentina? Okay, let's see. You need $2,000. You need a good conduct certificate. You need vaccine shots. You need to show that you're in good health. But again, the vaccination, it would be difficult in some cases to acquire all of this. If you're Jewish and you're trying to gather all of this, you don't have that kind of money necessarily anymore. Remember that Jewish businesses in the Third Reich, they're Aryanized. Many people lose their businesses or they're forced to sell them for a lot less than what they're worth. A visa and a passport. How easy is it to acquire these documents? You can go to our website, and Sally pointed that out to you, for Americans in the Holocaust. And you can see what you need to leave the Third Reich and what you need to come to the United States. So many of these things, you need good references. How many people have contacts in Argentina? It depends on who you are. It depends on your personal circumstances. You need 3 references, 3 financial references, 1 from a bank. So if we take this document and we look at it, is this an example of pull? Is this something that would attract you in 1939? You're Jewish and you've been through Aryanization. You don't have as much money anymore. Is this an example of pull or push back? So we can put our responses in the Q&A. And why, okay? Push, okay? This is, okay, you mean push back? Yeah, it is hard to attain all of these. So remember, is this an example of pull or push back? Pushing you back from Argentina, okay? Some of you are saying push back. Okay, they're not making it easy. It's very hard to acquire the money, to acquire this kind of documentation. It's almost, some of you are saying it's almost impossible to obtain these. They're making it very hard for you to go there. And it was very much the same situation in the United States as well. So you can take this document and compare it to the document that we have on our website for what you need to come to the United States. And it's very similar. And in short, they're both examples of pushback. So again, when your students ask you, why didn't they just leave? You have this kind of documentation that you need to acquire that's almost impossible, especially by this point, to get, that you can't go anywhere because most countries are really saying they don't want you so much. That's a huge message here. Excellent. So what we're going to look at next, do we have time, Linda? How are we doing on time?
We're good.
Okay. So now we're going to go over to Mexico, which is appropriate. Today's Mexican Independence Day. So if we look at the next document, so this is one of the few pictures that we have from the SS Kwanzaa. And I've included this because you just had the history. Sally showed you the video that we have that's on our website. And this one can kind of be either or. So if you're giving this picture to your students and looking at all of the factors for Mexico, okay, so look at the factors for Mexico, the pull factors and the pushback factors. Okay, does everybody see those? Okay, would this be considered an example of pull or push back? And you can write your responses in the chat or in the Q&A, sorry. Okay. Some people are saying pull. Okay, we're looking at the Kwanzaa picture. Okay, some people are saying push back. And remember to tell why. You know, why do you consider it to be one or the other? You know, what's your reasoning? Okay. So this one can be a little confusing. And that's good. And that's the reason why I put it in here. Because this one is kind of debatable. Because if you remember from the film Sally showed, it's basically showing that they're stuck in Virginia. This is a boat that first tried to go to Mexico. And some of the passengers who had visas to go to Mexico were denied. And now they're in the United States. So they were not accepted into Veracruz. So this could be an example of pushback, yes. And some of you have commented on that. But the interesting thing to note for your students is that they were ultimately, as the film shows us, they were ultimately given refuge here in the United States. This is, so yes, this is an example of pushback for Mexico. It could be possibly, depending on if you have all the facts, looking at it for the United States, they had a different situation. And so that's why I included this picture in here. They don't look happy. Some really good responses here. Thank you. So if we can look at the next slide. This is one of my favorite documents. This is an ID card that was given to this 16-year-old German Jewish boy, Nicholas Bodek, by a man named Gilberto Vosquez in Marseille, France. And one of the reasons why we've included this document is if you look at the date that it was issued, November 1941, in June of 1941, the consular offices are forced to close. The US consular offices and also the other Allied powers, if they had consular offices open by that point, by July of 1941, they were closing, and by October of 1941, you could no longer acquire a visa. You couldn't get out if you were living in the occupied territory. Marseille was very different. So if you look at the handouts that I sent you that we have on the pull and pushback factors for Mexico, look at what it says about Mexico's relationship with the Third Reich, with the German government. Okay, Marseille, France was one of the few places where you could leave. Because Mexico did have a relationship. They still had diplomatic relations with the government by that point. So their case is a little different. This is again why historical context is so important. And that's why that handout that Cody sent you that has the pull and pushback factors for Mexico is so necessary in order to better understand this document. So I'm going to ask the question, looking at this document, would you consider this document to be an example of pulling you to want to go to Mexico or pushing you back? Why and why not? So if you can write your responses in the Q&A, that would be great. And look at all the factors for Mexico. Okay, some of you are saying push back. Okay, push back. They're being turned away. Okay. This young man made it to Mexico because he was given this ID card that gave him permission. Some of you are saying pull, some of you are saying push back. It's pulling because they have a good relationship with the government. Yes. Okay. Mexico, of all of the countries in Latin America, at that time, Mexico was had the only democratically elected government. It was also the only really like left-leaning government too at that time. But they did start to institute restrictions. Gilberto Vosquez is a very interesting man. He was a consular official posted in Marseille. He had fought in the Mexican Revolution. He had very left-leaning views, and he did a lot to help Spanish Republicans, because keep in mind that the Spanish Civil War has ended, and now Republicans who were able to get out of Spain now need a place to go. And many of them did end up going to Mexico, and Gilberto Vosquez did issue thousands of visas. He also did give visas to European Jews, primarily German Jews, who were trying to get out at that time too, and went over. So it's pulling him. This would be an example more of pull, even though there are factors of no longer being able to get out of the occupied territories. Marseille was not occupied, okay? So that makes the difference. It's one of the few ports, and Sally showed that in the film that she showed, where you see the boats leaving the St. Louis and the Kwanzaa. If you look carefully, you'll see that Marseille was one of the last places where you could leave from Europe. And it's very extraordinary that this young man was able to leave. Gilberto Vosquez, and we're running out of time, Gilberto Vosquez was eventually put under house arrest by the German government for what he was doing. But the Mexican government was able to work negotiate for his release. And he was released, and he and his family were able to go back to Mexico City. And this lesson, the full lesson, has pictures of him arriving in Mexico City, and he's being welcomed by the German Jewish refugees who he saved because they were able to get to Mexico. So this document, again, it's one that you can use if your students can read Spanish. This is great for them. And they can interpret for the rest of the class. There's not a lot of text here to interpret, so it's pretty easy, and that's one of the reasons why we include it. But again, just making sure that your students are understanding the obstacles to immigration. And that's why we include the pushback factors. That's what can impede you from immigrating to a particular country. And it gets back to answering that question. Why didn't they just leave? We know why for the United States, and we want to investigate more why other countries, why was it difficult to go to other countries? But in spite of that, people still did go. So we'll just leave a few minutes for questions. Yes, and I'm looking at some of the comments. It is amazing that he was able to get this. And yes, the Mexican government, Mexico, as it says in the handout that you got, it was the only country in the League of Nations that protested Kristallnacht. That's the only government that really had this large outcry and started to impose sanctions because of Kristallnacht. Why didn't the Mexican government help Vasquez? Well, or why did they help him? Because at this time, they also wanted to bring in more Spanish Republicans. Mexico really wanted more Spanish Republicans more than anything else, and Vasquez was very critical to that. So in that way, the Mexican government said, you know, you can bring in more people because you've been so helpful for this, and that was why he was allowed to do that. And Nicholas Bodek, you can actually hear his oral testimony in the Shoah Foundation's, all of their recordings that they've done, it's included there. Does anybody have any questions about this? So you will receive all of these documents in the lesson. Linda will be posting them, I believe, tomorrow, Linda?
Yes.
Thank you. And I just want to say, because this lesson is one that it's a draft lesson. It's one that we're working on. We've been working on it off and on, but we really feel that right now is a good time with so many things that are happening, that a lesson like this can really help for a lot of students to get a broader picture of the global response to the Holocaust. So I want to thank you all very much. You have my email address if you have any more questions about what I presented to you. You also have Sally's. So thank you so much. And to all of you, just good luck this school year. We know it's a very difficult one, but we are here to support you. And please email us if you have any questions or concerns or you need help with something. Thank you. Linda, thanks.
Thank you to Sally and to Christina. It's all about what you have presented to us. You've given us something to think about. You've given us a lot of information. You've made it very relevant to a community that has immigration issues, both good and bad, what we're seeing is relevant to what's going on. Some of the materials that I've included in the supplemental materials have some books that are not necessarily Holocaust books, but are books that refer to children who are refugees or children that want to immigrate or emigrate. So those are there for you to use. We really appreciate the time that you have taken out of your crazy days. You know, I can't even imagine what the teachers that are teaching children and have children at home, and it's crazy. It's crazy world, but we appreciate your time. Tomorrow you will get a brief survey that will be generated by Zoom. It is primarily for our demographics. Our center at FAU is totally funded by by donations. And so I write a lot of grants and put out a lot of proposals. And of course, what they need is some data that we can show that what we are doing is being successful or not. Certificates of completion will be sent through Zoom as well. I'm not exactly sure when that's going to happen. But for those of you that are in districts other than Broward, if you need to get professional development points, the certificate should suffice for you to give to your whatever department they call it now, for your in-service credit or to get points for what you need. Those of you that are in Broward, you will be registered by us. I will send your information to be registered into LAB, which is the in-service, whatever the system is now called, but it's LAB. If you are a Broward educator and you registered with your personal email address, please email me your Broward Schools email address. We cannot register you in LAB unless we have your Broward Schools email address. If you want to contact us, the information is on your agenda. You can contact me. We are always available. We are not in the office. We're working remotely, but we're happy to meet with you virtually and bring in other information. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Cody, because without you, I would be not sleeping at night. But thank you very much. Everyone have a great evening and good night.
Linda, do you want to mute?
I think we could stop recording though.